Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. I know I got to see a bunch of you at Bard last week for the conference that we had on tribalism and cosmopolitanism, and it was always great to see you. Members of the virtual reading group came from Europe and Asia and all over to join us at the conference, and I have to say, it's greatly appreciated. It's fun. It reminds us that this is a long-standing community as well as a reading group, and very excited to see those of you who made it. So thank you. We are currently reading Arendt's book Between Past and Future. And we are in the middle of her essay, What is Authority? I think I said this last time we met, but I want to say it again because it's something I think can't be emphasized enough. There are ways in which this could be argued. This essay, it could be argued, is in many ways at the absolute core of Arendt's political thinking. So much of what she is doing is thinking through the problem of the loss of authority and how it impacts politics. And so it's not an accident that in this book, which she calls 8 exercises in thinking about politics, one of them, one of the first, I think the first topical one, is on this question of authority. She calls it, she asks, what is authority? And she immediately says, we could have asked what was authority. And the reason is that authority, she thinks, has been lost. And it's this loss of authority, part of the break in tradition, that for Arendt is the great problem in our politics. Now, you might think, well, why? I mean, everyone's worried about authoritarianism today. Everyone's worried about too much authority. Why is the loss of authority so important? It's because Arendt understands authority as she defines it in 2 ways on page 91 and 105. This is a little bit review, but I want us to remind ourselves where we're at. On page 91, she defines authority as an authentic and undisputable experience that is common to all, right? So the break in tradition, the loss of authority, it means that this common experience is no longer there. And on page 105, she defines authority again and says that authority implies an obedience in which men retain their freedom. Now, this is the key, right? An obedience in which men retain their freedom. That is why the loss of authority, the absence of authority, the fact that we can barely even remember what authority is so important. Because our inability to recall authority prevents us from realizing the real threat to democracy today, which is that we have no way of imagining freedom absent coercion and power, right? I mean, the premise of democracy, of the rule of the people, is that everybody rules and thus nobody is ruled. And yet, obviously, democracy can also be very much a kind of tyranny of the majority or tyranny of the people, in which people are ruled, whether it's by the people as a majority or by elected representatives or by experts. In any of these cases, democracy becomes a form of rule. And authority for her is important because it is a counterexample of a form of obedience free from power and violence. So, we often think of authority in the private sphere. A parent or a teacher has authority over their children. But as soon as the parent raises their hand to threaten even hitting the child, they've lost authority, right? At that point, the sort of common experience, common to all, that the parent is authority and the children has to obey and does so freely, is lost even with the threat of violence. The idea that authority implies obedience in which men retain their freedom is lost when the teacher has to punish the student. And without authority, she says, there's simply no possibility of a plural government of different people, absent ruling violence. And so the loss of authority for her is a marker of this problem that we have entered into, in which we no longer can imagine a free obedience and thus a free and plural world. She's not going to solve the problem, right? But the exercise in thinking, as this essay is called, right, is an attempt to clarify the issue, to help us to understand, A, why authority matters, right? B, the loss in authority, and C, most importantly, what would it mean today to live without authority in a way that could reimagine and re-embrace freedom without authority, because she doesn't think authority is coming back. And that's what the essay is about. That's why the next essay in the book is called What is Freedom? And we will explore it there. These two essays, obviously, What is Authority and What is Freedom, are go together and are not only at the center of this book, but I honestly do believe are at the center of the entirety of Arendt's political thinking. All right, to remind ourselves, after the long introductory essay, part of this essay, where she clarifies the issue of what is authority and what was authority, she says there are 4 questions, channeling Passover here. And the 4 questions are: first, what were the political experiences that corresponded to the concept of authority and from which it sprang, right? And here she's going to contrast the Greek and the Roman political experiences from which authority sprang. And the argument is going to be is that the Greeks had no political experience of authority. And as a result, 2 great Greek thinkers had to invent authority in politics, absent an experience of it in politics. And so Plato and Aristotle turn away from politics towards the private realm, and in doing so, import non-political ideas of authority into the political realm from the private realm. For Plato, as we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, for Plato, the authority that he finds is in the realm of expertise, things like a helmsman who steers a ship, or a shepherd who takes care of his flock. And so Plato thinks that the expert, or the philosopher king, who has access to the vision of the true, which the rest of the people don't have access to. So it's not a political idea, because it's not something that we all share as equals. It comes from the realm of philosophy, or reflection, or seclusion, or solitude. And the philosopher sees the truth and then comes back into politics and imposes that truth like a measure on the people. Aristotle is going to say, okay, not the philosopher king, but we're going to educate the people into the truth of authority. But both Aristotle and Plato don't see this as a political education. They see it as coming from outside of politics. It's only when we get to the Romans that Arendt says that there was an actual political experience of authority, not in private life, not in education, but in the experience that the Romans had of their foundation, of the beginning of Rome, that was alive and part of the Roman tradition, religion, and authority and their culture, in which people actually took part in politically rituals of reattaching themselves and re-engaging with the beginning, the foundation, that provided a kind of experience common to all, right? Of the authority of the Roman politics, that was something that was part of the Roman, in a sense, state religion. And so in sections 2, she talks about Plato. In section 3, she talks about Aristotle. In section 4, she talks about the Romans. In section 5, she talks about the loss of this tradition of authority, the loss of the Platonic, the Aristotelian, and the Roman ideas of authority in politics in the modern world, through a bit through Luther, but mostly through Thomas Hobbes. And she asks what kind of world came to an end after the modern age, not only challenged one or another form of authority in different spheres of life, but caused the whole concept of authority to lose its validity altogether. And that's section 5. In the final section, section 6, she brings the problem to a final point and says 2 things. One is there's no way, or 3 things, let's say. One is there's no way to restore authority. 2 is that the modern attempt to restore authority is through revolution. And those revolutions generally fail because authority can't restore itself, with one exception, the American Revolution, which she thinks succeeded, but she thinks its success has now run its course, and it now has lost its authority. And she thinks we're no longer in a position to reestablish authority through a revolution. And what this means, she says, is we're left with a fundamental problem at the end of how to live together in a world of plurality, absent authority. Fundamental question of how we live together in this new world. And so on page 141, she ends the essay saying, "For to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the concomitant awareness that the source of authority transcends power and those who are in power," right? To live without authority, and even to live without the awareness that authority means transcending power, means to be confronted anew, in ways that maybe long times ago we were, but haven't been for many years. Be confronted anew without the religious trust in a sacred beginning, so without a religious belief in the foundation, and without the protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior, by the elementary problem of human living together. And that's the problem we have. How do we live together? And she says that without authority, right? Living together generally is going to devolve into power politics. And we need to figure out how to do that without that happening. So I talked last week about chapter 2 or part 2 of the essay on Plato. And again, the core idea of her essay on Plato is that Plato had no political example of authoritarianism, of authority. And so he had to invent one in politics, and he imported it, I said, from the private sphere, the household, who ruled like a despot over his family and slaves and children. and thus violently without authority. So Plato had to think, all right, well, how do we give the despot authority that is not violent? And his answer was that you find authority in the rule of the laws. And but the laws then have to be seen as true, as above the interplay of power, as not just the despot's laws. And his answer to that is that there are philosophers, those few among men, who can free themselves from this world and turn to the ideas, and see the truth and see the true rules, and that the philosopher king and the rule of the philosopher king imposes those rules on the rest of the people, not as an act of violence, but as a claim of true obedience. And yet, Plato's ideas do employ an element of violence, she says, because most of the people, the vast majority of the people, can't see the truth of the Platonic ideas, and thus they have to be, in a sense, duped or tricked by myths and threats and rewards, and the myth of air, like hell, rewards of rebirth and a better world. And this nullifies the idea of authority for her. The next chapter, part 3 of this essay, turns to Aristotle and says that, like Plato, Aristotle was also concerned with this basic problem of how to conceive authority without coercion or persuasion. But he wanted to do so without Plato's idea of truth. Aristotle didn't believe that the few philosophers could see into the truth and that gave them the right to rule over everybody else. So Aristotle's answer is to substitute for truth education. And she says on page 118 that the substitution of education for rule had the most far-reaching consequences, right? The consequences are such that the rulers have often posed as educators, and we hear this a lot, right? If we could just teach the people to see rightly, they would all obey us. If the newspapers simply spoke the truth and taught people the right way to act and the right way to think about the world, then we would not have these problems. The problem, of course, is that for Arendt, this educational idea of authority that Aristotle embraces ignores something else that he also understood, and he's one of the great thinkers of, which is plurality. Because the point is that people in the world, adults in the world, disagree, and there is not one truth. And if there's not one truth, you can't educate people into one truth. And so Arendt says that that to try and educate adults into the truth is a kind of violence. And on page 118 to 119, she says that rulers have posed as educators, and educators have been accused of ruling. The idea here is that since in politics we deal with adults, not children, the idea of education is politically irrelevant. We politicians cannot and should not speak in the role of educators, because in so doing, they claim to be telling adults what they should be thinking and what they should be doing, and that's a kind of violence. I mean, there's a way in which persuasion, right, can be a form of education, but it has to be a form of education confronts each other as equals, not from a master teacher down. And so on page 119, she writes, political authority can acquire an educational character only if we presume with the Romans that under all circumstances, ancestors represent the example of greatness for each successive generation, and that they are the mejores, the great ones, by definition. What this means is that any politician who seeks to educate adults is like a tyrant. is someone who's claiming a kind of mastery over their fellow citizens and their right to educate them. The only way education can lead to true political authority is if the educators are not living, are not part of our current world, are not people who seek power. And the only political experience of non-living educators of the people, Arendt says, was in Rome, where the Romans worshipped almost as sacred the foundation and thus their ancestors. And we learn not from current uh, uh, people seeking power and thus illegitimately, but from the example of the greater ones, the ancestors. And so there are three ideas of how to establish political authority that she thinks have been handed down to us by the ancients. The first is Plato, right? The idea that political authority is handed down through ideas and myths, and thus a kind of domination where the few see the ideas, employ myths to, in a sense, dupe the majority and thus dominate them. Aristotle, in which there are elders, parents, wise old men, who seek to educate the people. But again, as people educating the people, it's another form of domination. And then there is Rome, where you have ancestors, and there is a bond from the foundation down. And she says this is the only political, truly political form of authority, because it's an education without domination. And she says wherever we see political education without this Roman conviction, whenever we see people say we just have to teach the people, we have to educate the people, but without this tradition of authority, it's a pretense to educate. This is on page 119. It's a pretense to educate, where in reality it's really a form of domination. The next chapter, right, on Rome, is her sort of exploration of the one place in the history of the Western tradition where she thinks authority as a political idea truly emerged, and that was in Rome. The core here is that you have that the Roman Republic, as you know, this is largely based on a reading of Aeneas, the Aeneas, and other texts. But the idea is that the Roman word authority, auctoritas, from augere, to augment, is that all authority is an augmentation, a building up of a foundation on which it's based. And the authority is based in that foundation, and the people who augment it are the Senate. The Senate are nobles. Power in Rome is not in the Senate, it's in the assembly. The people have it, the tribunes. But the Senate, by descent and transmission, acts as the incarnation of the greater ones, the maiores, the founders of Rome. And so the point is that the Senate doesn't make the laws, but they help guide the people through the spirit of the foundation. And so on page 120, Arendt says, at the heart of Roman politics from the beginning of the Republic until virtually the end of the imperial era stands the conviction of the sacredness of foundation, in the sense that at once something has been founded, it remains binding for all future generations. The Romans saw the foundation as the bond to which we constantly return. Religion, the Roman religion, is thus understood as being tied back to, religare, to tie back to the beginning, obligation to the past, to the founders, to the great ones. And Livy, one of the great Roman writers, writes, while I write down these ancient events, I do not know through what connection my mind grows old, and some religio holds me, some religion, some retying back to. And so everything is about the two great Roman gods, Janus, which is the god of beginning, and Minerva, the god of remembrance. And it's not an accident that Janus is January, the beginning of our year. But it is a constant return to the beginning, right? The beginning is what holds the end. And what we have to constantly do is remember with Minerva that beginning. The famous SPQR initials, which are all over Rome in little, carved into buildings and cobblestones. Senatus populusque Romanus. While power resides in the people, auctoritas rests in the Senate. Authority, in contradistinction to power, has its roost in the past, right? Montesquieu, who was one of the great thinkers of this Roman tradition, from whom Arendt learned a lot, says that the judiciary, as the third power in government, is this null power that has authority but no power. And in her book on revolution, in the chapter on authority, chapter 5, Arendt says that the great luck of the American Revolution was that they were able to transfer the Roman Senate, the idea of the Roman Senate as this institution that had authority but no power, to a new institution, the Supreme Court, right? So her argument is that the American Senate is not have any connection to the Roman Senate. I mean, maybe in some sense it does. It's supposed to be a little bit more aristocratic than the House of Representatives, but it still is an institution of power, of voting and selection. The Supreme Court, which is not based in power, supposedly, is supposed to have no power and is supposed to represent what she calls a constitutional convention in constant motion and that continues forever. And the Supreme Court justices thus are supposed to, in a sense, she actually says this in her book, they are reincarnations of the founding generation who are debating the principles, the Constitution from the beginning up. And so that was for her the great innovation of American government. She then gives another image of this. So if you remember that in the first section of the essay, she gives 3 pictorial images of authority. The first one of pure authoritarianism is a pyramid, right? With power at the top, and authority is filtered down through the levels. Okay, that's sort of classic authoritarianism. The second is tyranny, where there's power at the top, and then there's the people at the bottom, but there's no intervening layers. There's no one who intervenes. The tyrant simply just rules everyone at the bottom. And then there's the totalitarian idea of authority, where power is at the center, and in each ring, there are people looking in. These are the true believers of the party. They look in towards the power, and they understand the pure power politics of the totalitarian ruler. But at each level, there's also people looking out to the further levels. These are the not true believers, but the people who, fill out the forms and think they're, and follow the rules and think they're following the rules, and provide a kind of legitimacy to the complete loss of legality and totalitarianism of the totalitarian ruler. Now we have a new image of the Roman pyramid, but it's not a pyramid with the pyramid at the top or an onion. It's an inverted pyramid. So the pyramid now is at the bottom. And the bottom of the pyramid is actually under the earth. It's in the forgotten past, or in the could be forgotten past, but remembered through stories and religion and traditions. So she writes, if one wants to relate this attitude to the hierarchical order established by authority, and to visualize this hierarchy in the familiar image of the pyramid, it is as though the peak of the pyramid did not reach into the height of the sky above, but into the earth and the depth of an earthly past under the ground, right? And this, she says, was the Roman idea of authority, and she calls it a trinity, the trinity of religion, tradition, and authority. And on 125, she writes, the strength of this trinity lay in the binding force of an authoritative beginning, to which religious bonds tied men back through tradition, right? The Trinity is, there's an authoritative beginning, the Maichores, to which we owe some allegiance and which we are inspired by. And when we inspired by it, we obey it freely without power. And what ties us to that beginning is one, religion, a religare, a retying back to that through rituals, but also through traditions, which teach us of the glory of these people and the traditions that hold us together as a people. And so she cites Augustine, right, who writes that the seat of the mind is memory. And it's this memory, Minerva, that holds us back to Janus, the beginning. The problem is that if any one of these three parts of the Trinity, right, authority, religion, or tradition, are broken, the whole Trinity falls apart. And thus, things like the separation of church and state implies that the political has lost its authority. You can't have authority without a religion, a state religion. You can't have authority after the break in tradition. And she says the great error of the moderns, right, our error, is to think with Luther that he could save authority while denying the authority of church and king. That you could, in a sense, let people read the Bible in the vernacular, right, by themselves, deny the power of the religious leaders, and somehow still have authority. And also, the error of the moderns is in the error of Hobbes and other political theorists of the 17th and 18th centuries, who hoped that you could, authority and religion could be saved, but without tradition, right? Hobbes was an anti-traditionalist who thought that we had to replace tradition with reason and challenge all the traditions. And Hobbes did so and tried to make politics a science that would overturn tradition. Similarly, another group of moderns, the humanists, also made a mistake, which is to think that it would be possible to remain within an unbroken strain of Western civilization and authority without religion, right? And without authority, the Kantian idea that that we're autonomous, that we don't listen to, there is no heteronomy, and that we are enlightened, that we are free thinkers, who are free without religion, without the whispered voice of some tutelary nature, as he says in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Narles. That doesn't work. And so these are the errors of the moderns. To take one part of the Trinity or two parts of the Trinity away destroys all authority. And then she comes in section 5 to discuss the danger, right? And the danger is that once religion is lost, once tradition is lost, and once people no longer believe in hell, authority disappears, right? I mean, this is basically the argument here, that to give up on hell is to lose authority. And she says that both in France and in America, the people who were trying to create revolutions and create new governments insisted that we create religious sanctions that would lead people to believe that those who don't follow the rules, don't follow the laws, would go to hell, because they thought there was no way to guarantee the people to obey without threats. The removal of hell, she says on page 133, is the most significant consequence of secularism. Because, as Plato knew, most people will not see the truth. They need to be terrified into it. Without authority, without religion, without the truth, you need hell. And the loss of fear, she says, unfortunately, is now definite. It can't be brought back. She says on 135, and this loss is definite. And she continues, the fear of hell is no longer among the motives which would prevent or stimulate the actions of the majority. She just doesn't think it can come back. And since platonically speaking, the few cannot persuade the multitude of truth, because the truth cannot be an object of persuasion, she says, once we lose the fear of hell, we lose any ability to actually persuade people into obedience to the law. And she says that Hitler and Stalin show us the results of that. That unprecedented criminality is what results. And so she is worried, right, that without any authority, we are left in a world in which at any moment unprecedented criminality can emerge. The last section of the essay, section 6, basically offers her thesis, right, which is that Roman authority, the experience of foundation that the Romans brought into the world, the political experience of authority, has been lost, with one exception, the experience of authority that was that emerged out of the American Revolution. And then she says, is there thus hope for a new authority? And she leaves that as a question. She thinks it's unlikely. The theorist that she turns to here is Machiavelli, who she thinks that what's great about Machiavelli is that he understood that the Roman history depended on the experience of foundation, and that Machiavelli thought it should be possible to repeat through the foundation and create a unified Italy that would become the cornerstone for an eternal body politics. And what Machiavelli did understand is that you could not create a new foundation without some violence. And so she knew that from Cicero to Scipio, it was clear that to seize the dictatorship was necessary in order to restore the Republic and found the Republic anew. If the experience and the crisis of the present world is a political crisis, she writes, this is on page 140, in the decline of the Roman trinity of religion, tradition, and authority, then the revolutions of the modern age appear like gigantic attempts to repair these foundations, right? So the French, the Haitian, the Russian, the American revolutions are an attempt to repair the foundations of authority that have been lost, to renew the broken thread of tradition, and restore, through founding new political bodies, what for so many centuries had endowed the affairs of men with some measure of dignity and greatness. But, she says, all of the revolutions have failed to do so, to refound authority, with one exception, right? The American Revolution. She describes this, I guess, I think at length in books, in chapter 6, chapter 4, 5, I'm sorry, of On Revolution, the chapter on Constitutio Libertatis 2. And she says of the American Revolution that it is the least violent of the revolutions. And that it also, because there was already free, authoritative political institutions in America, in the states and in local governments and in town halls, they could fall back on these charters and agreements so that they would create a foundation that was rooted in an American past, and that the founding generation has created this constitution that for her, like the Roman Republic, is a beginning from time immemorial that we can constantly restore and refound. Whether that constitution can be preserved today into the future is obviously a question that is, it should be, I think, at the forefront of many of our thoughts. And then she ends with the lines that I already read for you on page 141. For to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the concomitant awareness of that the source of authority transcends power, and those who are in power, means to be confronted anew without religious trust in sacred beginnings and without the protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior, and to be confronted then by the elementary problems of human living together. That is the project of Hannah Arendt. to confront the elementary problems of living together in a world without authority, and to try and, in such a world, preserve both plurality and freedom. That's her political project. And that's why this essay is so important. All right, I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Remember, there's different ways to engage. You can engage in the chat. Please do be respectful of others. You can obviously criticize people's ideas, but don't criticize people. You can also go down to the reactions button and click raise hand and join the conversation with us. Look forward to it. And let's see, the first hand is Burl. Hi.
Hi, my name is Veerle. I'm from Belgium. I was very excited to have been following the conference last week in person. And I have a question because from Europe we look with big eyes to all what happens in United States and everything that has to do with the elections. And I'm trying to figure out on page 121, you have this saying by Cicero: in no other realm does human excellence approach so closely the paths of the gods as it does in the founding of new and in the preservation of already founded communities. And my question is, we saw this Bible that was presented by Trump, the Bible in which there is also the constitution, so the combining of the religion and the rule of law, the tradition. So I have this question. I have the impression that what Trump does, that he does kind of appeal to what humans naturally or instinctively are longing for or need or want. So this combination between the rule of law, religion, that's what Hannah Arendt says that is lost, and that he puts it together in some clever way, and that it can give an answer to some people who are in this loss of tradition, religion, and authority, and who are longing for a new religion, tradition, and authority. I don't know if I'm clear of what my question is, but I see that there is some kind of, I don't know, putting together of some elements in the way Trump makes his dialogue with people, and that it appeals to something with people that is in people.
Thank you, Fila. And first of all, it was great to see you at the conference at Bard. So thanks for making the trip from Belgium. So when someone, a politician in the United States, appeals to God, which, by the way, most American politicians do, right?
Mm-hmm.
God bless us. God bless America. These are phrases or that almost every politician utters in America. There's an attempt to re-enliven or to acknowledge the religious nature of American authority, no doubt. But for Arendt, that foundation is fundamentally one based on the Constitution. What she is amazed about in America is that somehow, and for some reason, that she has, she makes a number of suggestions about potentially why, but in the end she says, who knows? But she thinks that the Constitution in the United States somehow came to be worshipped, and that people felt that the Constitution was this sort of religious origin of the country, and that, yeah, I mean, we could reinterpret it. The Supreme Court could reinterpret it, but ultimately it was the beginning, and it was what founded. She thinks that if that feeling of reverence for the Constitution were to be lost, that would be the end of American authority. Now, that reverence for the Constitution can be connected with a kind of religious idea, but it's not one religion, right? I mean, I think what was always amazing about, I mean, there's always the reality and then there's the ideal. But what was often talked about in the United States was the Judeo-Christian religion, even though, of course, it was mostly Christian. But the idea was that it was not one denomination of Christianity, and it was more like a general religiosity that people had, that was transposed in politics into a worship of the Constitution. Donald Trump, I mean, we've been in this country, we've been dealing this week with a number of interviews given by his former chief of staff, the General John Kelly, who has basically said that Trump repeatedly told him and others that their job was to do what he told them. And when they responded to him, no, we took an oath of office, an oath, right? A religious oath, and swore not to do what Donald Trump said, the president, but to do what the Constitution says. And we take that oath very seriously. He was very upset by this. I mean, I think one of the most important things to understand about Donald Trump is he has no respect for the Constitution, no authority to the Constitution. And I think that's where, for many people, at least for someone like Arendt, I think, and certainly myself in this regard, the true danger of a second Trump presidency lies in that he will just simply his complete lack of any kind of feeling of authority to the Constitution, which he will have to take an oath of office to. And that's the kind of criminality without any religious foundations that Arendt is worried about. And so, whether he holds up the Constitution or holds up the Bible, I think the great danger Trump poses is that he is unbounded, untied to any authority and any tradition. And that's his real danger, and she thinks that is what opens the door to unlimited criminality. So that's where we're at. Thank you, Farrell. Ken.
I think you just answered my question. I mean, that's exactly what I was puzzling about. Are you saying that the belief, not just by Donald Trump, but the belief of Americans in the Constitution up to this point has been enough of an authority to prevent unprecedented criminality from coming into our government? And so are you saying it's not just his disrespect for the Constitution, but a national one that is allowing that's the force of authority that we've had up to this point that's kept a criminal out of the president's seat? I mean, besides his other 4 years when he didn't seem to be threatening criminality in the same level.
So first of all, I don't want to go on record saying that we've never had any criminality in the United States. I mean, this is a country of slavery and genocide against Native Americans. I don't think we should forget that. And there have been presidents before Donald Trump who had very little respect for the Constitution. One is his favorite president, Andrew Jackson, who, you know, at one point when then the Supreme Court said that he couldn't move the Native American tribes onto reservations, said, let the Supreme Court and their army try and stop me. So, you know, it's not like there's this one unidirectional history where everything's been hunky-dory and suddenly it ends with Donald Trump. I don't think that's the case. That said, you know, there is a way that over 200 years of American, or 200 and some odd years of American constitutional rule, the Constitution has been respected. There have been times when it's been threatened. There have been times, I mean, F. Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to pack the court, right? At one point. There have been times when the court has become deeply politicized, and there's times when the court became corrupt, and the times when the political system rejected it. It's not, again, it's not like it's always worked this way, but somehow there is this kind of religious, civic religious view that the Constitution is a profound obligation to us, and that somehow we come back to it. Just like the Bible, right? That tells people thou shalt not kill, and there have been many Christians who have killed. But and other religions too. I don't want to single out Christians. But the point is, at some point, those rules of the Bible, those commandments, can be re-enlivened, and people come back to them. And that's how I think Arendt understands the Constitution. But it's one that it's unclear if the authority of the American Constitution can be re-enlivened anymore today. I mean, I don't think it's a fait accompli that it can't be. I mean, I think people still do talk reverently of the Constitution here, but unfortunately, more and more people talk only about it as a utilitarian ploy. When it serves their interest, they revere it, and when they don't, they don't. And that is a sign of the weakness of that tradition.
Wasn't that the appeal that the generals weren't the generals appealing to the Constitution? Isn't that specifically what they said? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think for some people, especially a lot of people in the military, the oath that they swear to the Constitution, and the fact that they swear an oath to the Constitution and not to the president, is still meaningful. You know, and yet, if you were to ask many people, I think, on this call, or many people in my classrooms, and you say, you know, does the oath to the Constitution matter? They would laugh. They don't think it matters. And yet a lot of these generals don't laugh. And, you know, if you have hope that a second Trump presidency will not be a disaster, I think one reason you have hope is that there are still enough people who believe in the authority of the Constitution rather than the authority of the president. Vigdis.
Yeah, I've just short question about what Arendt says that she is doing in these essays, because she says in the preface that the following 8 essays are exercises, and their only aim is to gain experience in how to think. They do not contain prescription on what to think or which truth to hold. And when she says, like she does on page 140, at the top, for if I am right in suspecting and so forth, and on 104.
Vigdis, I'm losing you. I don't hear you anymore.
Oh, I had muted. Sorry. Oh. Yeah, how much did you hear?
She said on page 140, what?
On 140, she says, if I'm right in suspecting that the crisis of the present is primarily political, and the famous decline of the West consists primarily in the decline of the Roman Trinity and so forth. On 141, she says, however that might be, and then come. What I am asking is just that, might this just be a reminder of she's giving some kind of train of thoughts in these essays, but she's not giving any saying this is how it was. This is a kind of exercise in how to think.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. There's no answers given in this. She says that we have to, in order to think and confront anew, right, without a religious trust in a sacred beginning, and without protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior, the elementary problems of human living together, we're going to have to think that anew. And that means think it between past and future. Think it, as we talked about in the opening preface, right? In this sort of intersection of the past and the future, and find some new way of living together. Now, I think there's an openness to this, which is, does that mean we should give up on authority completely and figure out how to live without authority? That's one option. And the other is that we have to be open to a new emergence of authority. And I think you could read her both ways. I mean, there are times where she says, look, the loss of heaven and hell is definite. It can't come back. The loss of authority is pretty definite. And yet, even after she says that, she then offers the example of the American Revolution and says, here's an example in which authority was created. And she says it was unexpected and it was never been repeated. No one else has done it. So I think it's an open question. I think, she does think that without authority, the idea of freedom is very hard to imagine without leading to criminality and chaos. And yet there may be ways to do it. But the first step in thinking is understanding the problem. And that's why this is the first substantive essay in this collection, because it seeks to understand the remarkable depths of our problem, which is confronting the loss of authority. Hannah.
Hi, I was just, first of all, thank you for the conference.
Thank you.
It just struck me when you were speaking about, that, I'm sorry, I lost my page. Let me get to it. All right, so, she's saying that the loss of authority is this total problem. But what I wonder is, it doesn't seem to me at all to be a problem in the Muslim world, for example. So she universalizes this, or maybe just in the West or whatever. But to me, it is not necessarily a universal problem. First of all, yeah. So, who is the we? Because from what I can tell, it was very interesting. I listened to a podcast the other day, and this Israeli named Mariel Borelli or something spent years, about 8 years, anonymously he was trying to learn Arabic, and he would talk to, and he's published a book on this, and he would talk to thousands of Muslims in different countries, Palestine and other countries. And they were actually telling him, so many of them, that, Israel doesn't exist, that Jews, that the original, that there's only one religion and it's Islam, and that Abraham was a Muslim, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's, we don't have time to get into it now. So the point, but my question, so I mean, it was very shocking to hear. But so it seems to me there's great authority remaining in, for example, let's say a large swath of the Muslim world. They want Sharia law. They have it in many places. And I just wondered what your thinking is on that.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. You know, there's a couple ways to answer that. One is, you know, Arendt is not a student of or writing about non-Western worlds, and people criticize her for that, right? You know, she doesn't talk about the Haitian Revolution, and you know, why not? And if she did, maybe she would find something else. And I think there's no doubt that, as with any thinker, there's going to be limits and lacunae to what they write about and say.
Well, can I just say one thing, Roger? I think what I was trying to get at so inarticulately is that I think that it's perhaps one way is there's definitely a loss of authority in our Western world. And I think it's just a genius, again, another incredible genius essay. But it could be that there's an issue. One of the reasons why there's so much conflict in certain ways is that there's a loss of authority in the West and not elsewhere. Do you see
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
No, Hannah, I understand the point. I
Okay.
was just saying, first of all, right, that you know, Arendt herself doesn't write so much about this. You know, there's a number of things to say about you know, Islam, and I am no expert on Islam. One of which is to say that you know, Arendt has a view of authority, right, where we talk about the pyramid, right, of traditional authority, and in a political in a tyranny, the power is at the top, and then there are levels down. In Christianity, she says the top is sort of through into God, right, and not human, and as a result, the authority comes down, and the advantage of Christian authority over tyrannical authority is that it's not human. And as long as that is believed, it gives Christian authority a kind of authority without power, without human power, which is why it was so powerful for so long.
Right.
To the extent, you know, there are, of course, still Christians who believe and still see God as an authority. And there are Muslims who believe and see God as authority, and Jews and many others. And so if the point is that there are more Muslims than Christians who still believe in sort of an absolute authority, you know, that's an interesting point. Now, there is a, you know, a famous book came out about 10 years ago, called Submission by Michel
I read it.
Houellebecq, a French writer who, by the way, my colleague at the Hannah Arendt Center, Wyatt Mason, just profiled in the New York Times last month. So if you're interested in Michel Houellebecq, I encourage you to read Wyatt's account of the interview with him. But in that, Michel Houellebecq imagines an alliance between the Muslims and the Catholics in French politics against the feminists and the liberals, because it's the Muslims and the Catholics who believe in the authority of the French, of the traditional French Catholic political world, and he imagines that it would be a Muslim-led government with the support of the French Catholics. You know, I think that there is a way in which one could imagine in certain countries and in certain places an alliance of different religious parties, right? Muslim, Jewish, Christian, against secular liberals. That's what Houellebecq is imagining. Whether you know, actually existing Muslim countries are actually run by a fidelity to the Quran is a question I can't opine on. I don't have the political or religious knowledge to do so. But you know, someone asked the question earlier about Donald Trump holding up a Bible. I think there's no doubt that there are elements of fundamentalist Christianity in the United States and elements of biblical Judaism in Israel and elements of fundamentalist Islam in many parts of the Islamic world that are in rebellion against a kind of secularism and are promising to bring back a different kind of political authority. I think the Arendtian answer to that is this is not possible anymore, and such claims are generally illegitimate and deceptive in hiding a claim of power in a claim for authority. I mean, that's her approach, such that it's a refusal to confront the loss of authority in our times. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual Christians or Muslims or Jews who truly do believe in the authority of God. I fundamentally believe there are, but I don't believe that any public political movement is governed by that anymore.
What about the theocracy of Iran?
Again, I'm not an expert, but I don't believe it is. I could be wrong. I don't want to. I don't need any fatwas against me or anything
Right.
like that. But I'm skeptical. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Glenn.
Hey, Roger, thanks, first of all, for all the effort behind the live stream. We got good audio and good video and a real sense of being there for those of us.
We have a great team at the Arendt
Wow.
Center these days, and I appreciate their help. So I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Please pass on our thanks, those of us who are in the diaspora of the VRG. I want to understand better, Roger, one thing you said, that truth cannot be an object of persuasion. And if I leave today's lecture with a better understanding of one thing, I want that to be it. If you have time and if your authority as a VRG leader allows it, tell us what you think will happen in the U.S. election. But take.
I'll pass. Yeah. So Hannah Arendt thinks of Plato, right, as the thinker that tried to create political authority through truth. And what Plato encountered, right, is that the people didn't listen. Socrates was killed by the people. He was unable to persuade them of the truth. The philosopher king, who frees himself from the cave and turns around and goes out of the cave and sees the light, when they come back into the cave, they're disoriented and they try and convince the people, and the people don't believe them, and it's dangerous and they might get killed. And so the lesson that Plato takes from this is that while the truth is something one sees, right? It's the idea in the mind's eye. Not everyone can see it, and so he has written over his academy, the Platonic Academy, where he teaches. Only those who know geometry may enter. Why geometry? Because geometry is the science of abstraction. It's the science of that if you know geometry, you don't ever see a square as a geometer, because a square is never a perfect square, right? It's always going to be slightly off, no matter how perfect I make it. The only place where you see a perfect square is in your mind's eye. The only place where there's no perfect circle in reality. The only perfect circle is in your idea of a circle. And so what Plato understands is that it's only people who can calculate in their heads who can see the true circle or the true square. And that teaches them to distrust reality so that they can see the truth in the ideas. And so that's why geometry is the first study for all philosophy. It teaches you, it frees you from the tyranny of reality. What that means, however, is that for most of humanity, learning the truth is very hard because we're not schooled in abstraction and distrust of reality. And so we have to we can't be taught it and persuaded by it by rational reasons, because we're still caught up in the fake world, in the world of images, and not the true world. And so she says that that is why all of Plato's dialogues incorporate myths and stories and fantasies. And there's an esoteric and an esoteric. The esoteric teaching is for the few who are able to do philosophy and free themselves from the real. And the exoteric is the stories of hell and reincarnation and punishment for those who can't. And out of fear that the people will kill the philosophers and kill the fools who know the truth, Plato embraces stories as an instrument of domination and transforms the ideas from something that is seen by the mind's eye into real measures of domination in the real world. And so that's what he means, that for Plato and in the tradition of Western philosophy, truth is something that can be seen by a few, but can't be taught to the many through persuasion. And thus the few get indoctrinated into the truth, and they are taught to use violence or threats of violence in order to govern the many. And that's the Greek foundation of authority, which is why she thinks it's not a true political foundation.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yep. John.
Let me also echo the being in the diaspora for the conference. It was a pleasure, and thank you to your technical team. It was very effective. Given the U.S. the U.S. Constitution as the basis of authority, how do we reconcile the differing interpretations of the Constitution, the originalist, or is the Constitution, or do we look at the Constitution as a living document applicable to the to each current time?
Yeah. So thanks, John. And let me first say, I am so glad you guys loved the technical prowess of our live stream, and I hope some of you joined Susan Oberman for the breakout sessions. But let me say, it's better in person, and I hope some of you remember that and come back, because I think the real magic happens in the moments of interaction at the conference, which is not to say you shouldn't watch the live stream.
I
I
hadn't
just-
intended, Roger, but life got in its way.
I know, I completely understand. I just want to, make a pitch for it. Make your plans for next year. That said, there are different methods of interpretation, and there's a textualist approach to interpretation of the Constitution, right? Which is that you look just at the words. That doesn't really work, but it's there. Then there's the originalist approach, which says the words will never tell you what the Constitution says, so you have to look at the intent of the people who wrote the words, and that's the originalist idea. And then there's another approach which says, you have to look not at you never know what the words mean, you'll never know what the intent was, so you have to treat the Constitution as a series of principles and try and think, what would the founders who had those principles think and do today? And that's what we often call the living constitutional approach. Arendt was certainly an advocate of the latter, the living constitutional approach. But they're all potentially valid as approaches to seeing the Constitution as an authority. From her point of view, the textualist one generally won't work very well, because it's very hard to think that the piece of paper has authority, or the words, what do they say? And it's very hard to know what they mean. She thinks the originalist one also, again, how do you know what the people who wrote the Constitution actually believed? It's almost impossible to know. So she thinks that the only way to really build a lasting constitutional authority is through an appeal to the power of the beginning and the principles in it. And so that's where she comes out. But they're all ostensibly, at least on their face, attempts to give the Constitution a kind of authority.
Doesn't that create an inherent conflict? I mean, if an originalist interpretation is just as in their minds, maybe as authentic and as I might have as a living document, and aren't we then headed constantly into a conflict?
I mean, I think you could have conflicts based on any interpretation, as long as the people believe that you have an authority to interpret it the way you do. Most people aren't gonna, get too in the weeds. That's, but the question is, how do you actually imbue the Constitution with authority? And Arendt thinks that it has to be a kind of reverence, and what you revere is not the piece of paper, and what you revere is not, the so-called opinions of these men who made them, but you revere the principles, the sort of spirit of the Constitution. So that's how she imagines it. William. William,
Can you hear me, Roger?
yes,
Can you hear me?
I do.
My question concerns whether the birthing moment of the Constitution or any Constitution is nonviolent. And
Is what?
I'm confused because on page 140, the middle paragraph, she emphasizes that the American Revolution was successful. The founding fathers founded a completely new body politic without violence. And then in the next paragraph, 5 lines or so down from page 140, she says the active foundation, namely the colonization of the American continent, had preceded the Declaration of Independence, by which I guess she's implicitly suggesting that she's taking account of the violence during the act of colonization of the American continent. And I'm unclear, does she really mean that a pure sense of authority is a nonviolent birthing moment? Or is it that after the fact we believe in the founding moment so important or so sacred that it is, we sort of read into it a nonviolence?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, to say that the American Revolution is without violence seems strange on many levels. I mean, we fought a Revolutionary War, not to mention colonization and other issues. She later says the relatively nonviolent character of the American Revolution, where violence was more or less restricted to regular warfare, is an important factor in this success. So she says that by regular warfare against the British, that's not what she means by nonviolent. What she means is that unlike the French, where you had the terror, or unlike the Russian Revolution, where you had people eating their own and killing and purges from the party and other things of that sort. She thinks that once America freed itself, liberated itself from the mother country in England, there were already existing institutions of governance, the states, the colonies, the local town halls, the fora for governance. That meant that there was already a kind of civic religion of democracy, of voting, obviously limited to men and limited to white men. And those are important caveats and issues. But she thinks that in the thinking about authority and freedom, these white men that were then founding the American government could fall back on already existing charters and institutions and agreements that didn't need to be made anew. And so they didn't have to violently take power. There was already power there. That's what she has in mind. And since there was already power there, once England was out of the picture through regular warfare, suddenly things picked up again, and they could imagine they didn't need to create a whole new system of government and power. They already had one. They just had to now start using the old one they had anew. And that's what she means by the relatively nonviolent aspect of the revolution. Peggy.
Hi. I am interested in what role the concept of hell played in enforcing the rule of law, or enforcing the whatever authority, whatever authoritarian structure. There was this, she says something about violence being endemic because of this, those that looked from heaven or above down on the suffering of those in hell. It's astonishing to me that it requires mythology of that sort to subdue or induce obedience by the populace. And how could that possibly last as literacy grows?
Yeah.
Wh-
Well, I mean, maybe you can't. I mean, you know, with Luther, with the rise of literacy and Protestantism, right? Part of what happened is that Luther says to people, you can read the Bible for yourself. And then the Bible is printed in vernacular rather than Latin for the first time. And people start reading it. And this is part of the loss of authority that she's talking about. And so that's one of the reasons why she thinks that you can't go back. I mean, with literacy and the Enlightenment and thinking for oneself, it's very unlikely that people are just going to believe the stories of heaven and hell. And she doesn't think they're ever coming back. So this, you know, as she says, this law is definite. But but that doesn't change the fact that from Plato through Christianity, through even the founding of the United States in the 1770s and 1780s, and in France as well, almost everyone involved thought that you could not create a free society that had authority without heaven and hell. And they all sought to do so. I also to maintain that kind of biblical or fantastical story. You know, I go back to the question Helen asked about, or no, someone asked about Trump holding the Bible, and Helen asked about Hannah asked about you know, Islam. I mean, I think you know, part of what's going on in the world, whenever you hear the law and order or bring back morality or teach values and stuff, is it's a group of people who seem to want to bring back authority and believe that, you know, to do so, you have to come back to the classic religions that promise heaven and hell, rewards and punishments. The problem is, you know, we just don't live in a world where you can do that anymore. And that's what Hannah Arendt is forcing us to confront, and what those people don't confront. I see there's a couple more questions. We're out of time. Let me hope that we can keep these questions coming for next week. I think we're meeting next week. Yana, can you remind us what we're meeting for next week? It's What is Freedom? Is it the whole essay or part of it?
Yeah, we're reading part 1 and part 2.
Part 1 and part 2 of What is Freedom for next Friday.
Yeah, and then we're reading 3 and 4 next Friday, the following Friday.
Okay, so I look forward to reading What is Freedom with you. It obviously follows from What is Authority, and it's the loss of authority that requires us to rethink freedom today. And
Professor Roger, I just want to say one thing, and it's just thank you to you and your technical team for the conference. And I want to say that I do hope to be able to attend the conference in person one of the coming years. That's my message today.
We would love that for all of you. So thank you. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.